There are nights in London when the city's noise feels staged, taxis hissing on wet roads, cameras clicking like insects, the thin glow of studio lights reflected in black windows. And then there are nights when the noise suddenly changes its shape. It stops sounding like routine coverage and starts sounding like a perimeter tightening. That is the sound you hear when an institution built on ceremony collides with something it cannot choreograph. Illness. Uncertainty, the fear of time. For weeks, sometimes months, royal watchers can live inside a kind of national suspense. They count absences. They zoom into photographs for clues. They interpret calendar gaps like military analysts reading satellite images. In the digital age, the monarchy isn't only watched, it is tracked. And when a senior royal disappears from public view, the vacuum doesn't stay empty. It fills fast with speculation, conspiracy, and rumor dressed up as analysis. Britain has always understood that the crown is not just a family. It is a state symbol and instrument of continuity. That's why royal health becomes public weather. Not because the country is entitled to private medical details, but because stability is a national asset, and uncertainty makes people nervous. The last 2 years have rewritten that relationship in real time. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles III had been diagnosed with a form of cancer discovered during treatment for benign prostate enlargement. The statement stressed that he had begun a schedule of regular treatments, would postpone public-facing duties, but would continue state business and official paperwork. It was a rare moment of directness and attempt to deny the rumor economy oxygen by providing a controlled dose of truth. And then, in March 2024, the focus shifted to the next generation. Catherine, Princess of Wales, released a recorded video message confirming that cancer had been found after abdominal surgery, and that she was in the early stages of what she described as preventative chemotherapy. Her words were not written like palace language. They were written like a mother trying to keep a home intact while the outside world demands access. This matters, because it changed the rules. The monarchy's default doctrine for decades has been restraint, distance, and the steady refusal to be pulled into the public's emotional tempo. But illness doesn't respect doctrine. It forces communication choices. And in 2024, the palace learned the cost of hesitation. Silence can protect privacy, but it can also invite a kind of narrative insurgency, one that spreads faster than any official correction. The clearest demonstration came in the visual battlefield. In March 2024, major news photo agencies withdrew an official Mother's Day image of Catherine and her children over concerns about manipulation. Catherine later apologized, saying she occasionally experimented with editing. What could have been a minor controversy became a trust accelerant. Fuel for those already convinced the palace was hiding something. In an information war, even a family photo can become contested terrain. From that point forward, the palace wasn't only managing health. It was managing belief. And belief is not a soft concept. Belief is power. It shapes legitimacy. It shapes national mood. It shapes what foreign capitals assume about British continuity in an era when every major state is calculating risk: economic, diplomatic, military. That's why this story cannot be treated as celebrity gossip. When the head of state is in treatment, when the future queen is in recovery, and when the line of succession becomes a constant undertone in public conversation, allies notice and adversaries listen. Not because they expect collapse, but because perception shifts can be exploited. Disinformation doesn't need to invent a new crisis. It only needs to widen cracks that already exist. In September 2024, Catherine released another message. She had completed chemotherapy and said her path to healing and full recovery would be long, taken each day as it comes, with a gradual return to public engagements. It was honest without being graphic, an attempt to reclaim the narrative with calm, human language rather than palace insulation. Then, in January 2025, she made an unannounced visit to the Royal Marsden Hospital in London and said it was a relief to now be in remission, adding that it takes time to adjust to a new normal. This was not only a personal update. It was a signal of controlled re-emergence rebuilding. Public confidence by showing presence while keeping medical specifics private. And in December 2025, King Charles, speaking in a message supporting Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer, said he had good news that, thanks to early diagnosis and effective intervention, his own schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced in the new year. Buckingham Palace and major outlets described his care shifting into what they called a precautionary phase, with ongoing monitoring. Put these events together and you see the real documentary story emerging. The monarchy is learning to communicate illness in public without surrendering privacy, and it is doing so under relentless scrutiny, with almost no margin for error. Now, step back from the official record and look at the atmosphere that surrounds it, because this is where your provided scenario lives. The sensation that something is unfolding behind closed doors. The feeling that the palace's silence is not simply quiet, but engineered. In any crisis, institutions do two things at once. They care for the human being, and they protect the machine. The royal household is a machine, staffed, scheduled, secured, branded. When health threatens the central figures of that machine, the response becomes both intimate and strategic. You can imagine the closed meetings not as melodrama, but as risk management. Not as villains and heroes, but as competing obligations. Protect the person. Protect the children. Protect the institution. Protect the country's sense of continuity. And here is the difficult truth. Those obligations can collide if you disclose too much. You expose a family, and especially children, to a lifetime of invasive attention. If you disclose too little, you create conditions where rumor becomes truth simply because it moved first. Either way, the palace loses something. The only choice is what kind of loss it can live with. Asterisk, this is why the public's hunger for updates can become a threat vector. People often think the danger is the illness itself. But there is a second war running alongside it. The war over narrative, over timing, over what the crown is allowed to admit without appearing weak, and what it must admit to remain credible. And in the modern media ecosystem, credibility is a form of defense, because a monarchy that cannot control its own story becomes easy to destabilize. Not toppled, just corroded. Not ended, just hollowed out. The kind of slow erosion that looks like drama on television, but becomes something more serious in the bloodstream of national identity. So when you hear whispers of an urgent press conference, when you see journalists camped outside gates, when you watch a news cycle turn absence into certainty, understand what you are really seeing. You are seeing a contest between two forces. A family trying to heal in private. And an attention economy that treats privacy as an obstacle to profit. If you've spent any time covering conflict, real conflict, you learn a principle that never stops being true. The first casualty is clarity. Not truth, not morality, clarity. Because when the stakes rise, everyone's senses sharpen and everyone's incentives distort. People fill blanks with fear. Opponents fill blanks with propaganda. Bystanders fill blanks with whatever story travels fastest. Royal health crises in the 2020s create a civilian version of that same fog. And tonight, before we go anywhere near whispers or dramatic claims, we start with what is actually on the record, because the monarchy, like a state under pressure, survives on one resource more than any other: credibility. The last confirmed timeline is not a sudden tragic turn. The last confirmed timeline is this: Buckingham Palace publicly announced King Charles III's cancer diagnosis in early February 2024, and said he began regular treatments while postponing public-facing duties, but continuing state business and official paperwork. That same spring, Catherine, Princess of Wales, disclosed in a recorded message that cancer had been found after abdominal surgery and that she was in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. In September 2024, she released another video message saying she had completed chemotherapy and would resume only light duties as she recovered. And on January 14, 2025, she stated it was a relief to now be in remission, describing the long work of adjusting to a new normal. That is the verified public record. So why then Does the atmosphere around a palace sometimes feel like an emergency broadcast? Like something is happening tonight, right now, any minute? Because the modern information environment doesn't wait for facts. It hunts for signals. And palaces, old institutions built to communicate, slowly create a lot of signal, simply by trying to stay quiet. In military terms. Think of it like this. You can keep radio silence to avoid detection, but radio silence itself becomes a clue. Observers notice the absence. Ascent accounts start mapping patterns. Commentators turn gaps into certainty. And soon, the silence you intended as protection is being interpreted as confession inside the palace. The response to that dynamic is not emotional. It's procedural. There is always a comes room, even if it doesn't look like a war room. The principals have private secretaries. The principals have press secretaries. There are legal advisors because in constitutional monarchies, even personal health intersects with state optics. There are security staff because crowds gather fast when uncertainty spreads. And there are medical advisors bound to confidentiality, but aware that even the existence of medical movement can trigger speculation. The question that dominates that room is never, what will people think? The question is, asterisk, what do we owe the public, and what do we owe the family? Asterisk, and in 2024 this wasn't theoretical. The monarchy was forced to practice it in real time, the clearest example of how fragile trust can become not from a speech, but from a photograph. In March 2024, Kensington Palace released an official Mother's Day image of Catherine with her children. Major agencies including the Associated Press, Reuters, Getty, and AFP pulled it because it appeared manipulated. The AP issued a rare kill notice. Catherine then publicly apologized, acknowledging she had experimented with editing. Here's what that incident did at the strategic level. It taught the world that even soft palace content could become contested evidence. It taught skeptical audiences to treat official releases like intelligence that must be verified. And once that mindset takes hold, every subsequent delay, every missing appearance, every brief statement gets read as part of a cover-up. Regardless of the underlying reality, that's how you get a pressure cooker. Now imagine the palace trying to operate inside that pressure cooker while managing real illness. On one side, there is a humane impulse: protect the children, protect the patient, keep medical detail private, stop the public from consuming a woman's suffering as entertainment. On the other side, there is an institutional imperative: if you communicate too little, you create a vacuum, and a vacuum is where conspiracy becomes governance. So the palace begins treating messaging like a controlled substance. Not because it enjoys secrecy, but because it fears a spiral. This is the part outsiders rarely understand. A palace is not one voice, it's a coalition of instincts. Some advisors always push restraint, minimize detail, reduce risk, preserve dignity. Others push transparency, say enough to prevent misinformation from taking the steering wheel. And the principal, the person actually living the illness, may want neither extreme. They may want quiet, honesty, and boundaries all at once, which is emotionally coherent but operationally difficult in a world that punishes nuance. And into that tension walks a new kind of threat. Not paparazzi at gates, but viral certainty. False breaking news packages can be assembled in minutes. A dramatic headline, a recycled clip of royal footage, an invented source, a fabricated urgent briefing. The content doesn't need to be true. It only needs to feel plausible against a background of anxiety. This is what modern disinformation does. It doesn't invent from nothing, it weaponizes what the public already fears. That is why timing becomes so central. Official statements, when they come, are usually timed to reduce chaos. Early morning releases that give newsrooms structure. Avoid market overlap, avoid parliamentary clashes. Avoid turning a health update into a nightly frenzy. We saw this logic in how Buckingham Palace framed King Charles' February 2024 diagnosis, clear enough to curb speculation, limited enough to protect medical detail. We saw it again in Catherine's March 2024 message, direct, personal, carefully shaped around the need to explain the situation to her children. And later, we saw it in the reassurance phase. Catherine's remission statement in January 2025 used a single medically meaningful word, remission, and then pivoted to recovery and gratitude, signaling progress without offering a clinical dossier. And in December 2025, King Charles' Stand Up to Cancer message described a reduction in treatment in the new year, with the palace calling it a precautionary phase under monitoring again. Optimism bounded by caution, that is the monarchy trying to do modern strategic communication. Feed the public enough verified truth to stop a rumor. Wildfire without feeding the fire with details that will be misused, but even perfect messaging cannot fully solve the underlying problem. The public's emotional stake in the Wales family has grown. Catherine is not treated like a distant royal. She is treated like a national figure people feel they know. In that emotional environment, any hint of uncertainty doesn't produce patience, it produces demand. And demand, when not satisfied, becomes aggression. That is why the palace's second war, the war over silence, is so punishing. The patient fights the illness. The institution fights the narrative. The family fights for normalcy. The internet fights for content. And the most vulnerable people in that entire equation are the ones who did not choose any of it. The children.